Imagine you're the governor of a small English settlement on the edge of the known world. You've just spent 3 years trying desperately to get back to your people. 3 years of war, of bureaucracy, of storms and delays and false starts. And then finally, your ship drops anchor off the coast of what is now North Carolina. It's August 1590. You climb ashore expecting to hear voices, smell cooking fires, see the faces of people you know. Instead, there's nothing. No people, no bodies, no signs of violence, no note explaining where everyone went. Just an abandoned fort, overgrown with grass and vines, as if the earth had already started the slow work of forgetting. And carved into a wooden post at the entrance a single word, Croatoan. That's it. That's all that was left of over 100 men, women and children who had been building a life here. One word. And more than 4 centuries later, we still don't fully know what it meant. Tonight, we're going to settle into one of the most quietly haunting mysteries in American history. The disappearance of the Roanoke colony. This is a story about ambition and bad timing, about the gap between what colonial powers imagined the New World to be and what it actually was. It's about a group of ordinary people caught between empires and weather and diplomacy they had almost no control over. And it's about what happens when history simply stops leaving breadcrumbs. There are no dramatic answers at the end of this, no smoking gun, just theories that each make a certain kind of sense, and a silence that has never fully lifted. If you're listening to this right now trying to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these. So let me know in the comments what time it is where you are and where you're listening from. I find it genuinely remarkable every time I check. Someone in Edinburgh at 2 a.m, someone in Melbourne just after sunrise, someone in Toronto who can't stop their thoughts long enough to close their eyes. All of you, somewhere in the dark, listening to the same strange story from 1590. There's something almost comforting about that. Roanoke Island sits in what are now called the Outer Banks of North Carolina, a narrow chain of barrier islands separating the Atlantic from the calmer waters of Pamlico Sound. In the late 1580s, it was the very edge of England's ambitions in the Americas, a small, low-lying island surrounded by shallow, treacherous waters, chosen not because it was ideal, but because it was available. And onto that island, England sent its hopes for a permanent foothold in the New World, along with 117 ordinary people who believed they were starting something that would last. They vanished instead. Let's begin at the beginning. To understand why 117 people ended up on a thin strip of sand off the coast of North Carolina, you have to understand what England was feeling in the late 1500s. And what England was feeling, more than anything else, was left out. Spain had gotten there first. Columbus had sailed in 1492, and in the decades that followed, Spain built an empire so vast and so lucrative, it was almost impossible to comprehend from the grey wet shores of England, silver from Peru, gold from Mexico, trade routes that stretched across 2 oceans. By the mid-1500s, Spanish treasure fleets were making regular crossings of the Atlantic, heavy with wealth that was flowing directly into the Spanish crown and funding Spanish armies, Spanish navies, Spanish influence across Europe. England watched all of this with the particular frustration of a nation that knows it's being outpaced and isn't entirely sure what to do about it. The rivalry between Spain and England wasn't just economic. It was religious, political, deeply personal in the way that rivalry between powerful states always becomes personal at the top. Queen Elizabeth I, who came to the throne in 1558, was Protestant in a Europe that was fracturing bitterly along religious lines. Spain's Philip II was the great champion of Catholic Europe. These two monarchs circled each other for decades, never quite at full war, but never truly at peace either. The tension had a low, constant hum to it, like a string pulled just past where it's comfortable. England's response to Spain's American dominance was, for a long time, essentially piracy, not the disorganized, romantic kind, something far more systematic. English privateers, men like Francis Drake and John Hawkins, sailed with unofficial royal blessing to raid Spanish shipping, harass Spanish ports, and strip Spanish treasure fleets of whatever they could carry off. Drake famously circumnavigated the globe between 1577 and 1580, raiding Spanish settlements along the way and returning to England with enough plunder to pay off the entire national debt. Elizabeth knighted him on the deck of his own ship. Spain was furious. England was delighted. But raiding was not the same as building, and England's leadership understood, with growing urgency, that to truly compete with Spain in the long run, England needed a base in the Americas, not just a port for privateers to resupply, though that was part of it, a permanent settlement, a foothold. Something that said, in the language empires use when they plant flags, we are here and we intend to stay. This is where Sir Walter Raleigh enters the story, or really just off the edge of it. Raleigh was one of the great figures of Elizabethan England, a poet, a soldier, a man of extraordinary ambition who had cultivated himself into one of the Queen's favourites with considerable skill. He obtained a royal charter in 1584 granting him the right to colonise lands in the Americas not yet claimed by any Christian monarch. The wording mattered. It was expansive enough to be useful, and vague enough to be flexible. Raleigh named the territory Virginia, after the Virgin Queen herself, which was exactly the kind of gesture Elizabeth appreciated. But Raleigh, for all his influence, almost certainly never set foot in the New World. His role was that of a patron, an organiser, a man who raised money and recruited ships and shaped the enterprise from a distance. The actual work of exploration he delegated to men like Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow, who sailed in 1584 on a preliminary scouting voyage. They came back with something arguably more valuable than gold. They came back with a story. The reports Amadas and Barlow brought home described a land of extraordinary abundance, gentle native peoples, fertile soil, rivers full of fish, forests full of timber, the air itself sweet and mild. These accounts were not entirely fabrications, but they were curated with an audience in mind. England needed to be persuaded that the New World was worth the risk, and so the descriptions tilted toward the ideal. The hardships were softened. The difficulties of the terrain, the climate, the distance, the sheer logistical challenge of sustaining a colony 3,000 miles from home, these things were present in the accounts if you read carefully, but they didn't lead the argument. Richard Hakluyt, a geographer and propagandist of considerable talent, was among those who helped shape the public and political imagination around English colonisation. His writings made the case systematically that England had both the opportunity and the obligation to plant settlements in America. The framing shifted depending on the audience. For merchants, it was trade routes and resources. For the crown, it was strategic advantage against Spain. For the adventurous, it was glory and discovery. For the pious, it was the spreading of the Protestant faith to peoples who had never heard it. There was a version of the argument for almost anyone willing to listen. And underneath all of it ran the practical military logic that never quite disappeared. A colony on the American coast could serve as a staging point for privateers raiding the Spanish Main. Ships could resupply there, crews could rest, prizes could be offloaded and assessed. It would shorten the range of English naval harassment against Spanish interest by weeks. This was not a romantic argument, but it was a persuasive one to people who dealt in strategic reality. What the maps couldn't convey, and what the enthusiastic accounts tended to gloss over, was the texture of what actually waited out there. The Atlantic crossing itself was brutal and uncertain, weeks at sea with all the misery that implied. The Outer Banks, that narrow strip of barrier islands where Roanoke sat, were notoriously difficult to navigate. The waters were shallow and shifting, the inlets unpredictable, the storms sudden and savage. Ships that approached too quickly or read the channels wrong ended up stuck or wrecked. And beyond the coast, the land itself, though genuinely beautiful in many respects, was nothing like a prepared stage for English settlement. It was a functioning world already, complex and inhabited, with its own politics and pressures that English colonists were almost entirely unprepared to understand. But in England, in the early 1580s, none of that weight had fully settled yet. There was a sense of possibility that hadn't been tested. There were investors willing to fund expeditions. There was a queen who saw strategic advantage in the venture. There was a young nation trying to step into a larger version of itself, and so the ships were readied, and the maps were consulted, though they petered out into speculation at the edges, and people who wanted very much to believe that the New World was waiting for them, open and generous and ready, began to sail toward it. Before we follow the colonists there, it's worth slowing down and actually seeing the place they were sailing toward, because the land itself is part of this story, maybe more than any of the human decisions layered on top of it. The environment didn't just set the stage, it shaped every choice, limited every option, and quietly determined what was possible, long before anyone carved anything into any tree. The Outer Banks are not land in the way most people think of land. They are a chain of barrier islands, thin ribbons of sand running parallel to the North Carolina coast, separated from the mainland by sounds that are broad and shallow and temperamental. Pamlico Sound to the south, Albemarle Sound to the north, neither of them deep enough to be truly forgiving. The islands themselves are the product of constant negotiation between ocean and geology, always shifting, always rearranging themselves in response to storms and currents and the slow pressure of tides. In some places, the distance between the Atlantic surf on one side and the calm water of the Sound on the other is less than a mile. You can stand in the middle and hear both. Roanoke Island sits just inside this barrier, tucked into the Sound rather than facing the open ocean. That positioning was not accidental. Navigating the Outer Banks from the sea required threading through inlets that were shallow, unpredictable, and changed their depth and location with enough regularity to make charts unreliable almost the moment they were drawn. Ships drawing more than a few feet of water ran a real risk of grounding, and the shoals off the banks had already earned a reputation among sailors that would only deepen over the centuries, a place that became known, eventually, as the graveyard of the Atlantic. Getting in was hard, getting back out with a laden vessel was harder, so the island offered something like protection by virtue of being difficult to reach. An enemy fleet couldn't simply sail in and shell a settlement on Roanoke the way they might attack a coastal town. The shallow water was a kind of passive defence, but here is the other edge of that same quality. The shallow water that kept enemies at a distance also kept supply ships at a distance. Every barrel of food, every replacement tool, every letter from home had to come through those same uncertain inlets. The isolation that might protect a settlement could, under the wrong circumstances, become the very thing that slowly suffocated it. The land on Roanoke Island was not without resources. The forests were real, dense with longleaf pine and live oak and cedar, timber that English eyes accustomed to heavily harvested English woodlands would have found genuinely impressive. The surrounding waters were extraordinarily productive. The sounds teemed with fish. Oysters grew in dense reefs. The marshes supported enormous populations of waterfowl that made seasonal hunting practical and reliable. A person who knew how to work with this landscape could eat well, could build, could survive. But fresh water was a complication. The island's groundwater was limited, and contamination from saltwater intrusion was a real concern, especially in dry seasons when the water table dropped. The soil, sandy and thin in many places, was not the deep agricultural earth that English farmers understood. Growing the crops that English settlers depended on, the wheat, the familiar grains of home, would have required both adjustment and patience that not everyone had brought along in sufficient quantities. What the land could support, and what the settlers expected it to support, were two different sets of answers to the same question. The climate added its own complications. Summers along the Outer Banks are long, humid and punishing, in a way that the English climate never is. The heat was a physical reality that wore people down and created conditions hospitable to illness. Winters, by contrast, could swing between mild and genuinely brutal, with storms that came off the Atlantic with little warning and remarkable force. Hurricanes, though the English didn't have that word yet, were a seasonal feature of life on the Carolina coast that no amount of optimism from a London pamphlet could adequately prepare someone for. None of this was unknown to the people who already lived there. The indigenous nations of the region, including the Secatan, the Wepameok, and the people of Croatoan Island to the south, had spent generations learning exactly how this landscape worked, what it gave, what it withheld, and when. They organized their lives around its rhythms with the kind of practical intelligence that comes from accumulated knowledge passed down over time. They moved seasonally when that made sense. They maintained trade networks across the sounds and up and down the coast, exchanging copper and shell beads and food and information in patterns that connected communities across considerable distances. These were not isolated, static populations. They were part of a functioning regional web of relationships, alliances, tensions, and exchange. The Croatoan people in particular occupied an island to the south of Roanoke, and they had developed a reputation, at least among the English who would come to know them, for being more consistently open to contact than some of their neighbours. Their leader, Manteo, would eventually travel to England twice, which tells you something about the complexity of the relationships forming in this period, and about the fact that some indigenous people saw in the English not just a threat, but a potential source of new leverage in the politics of their own world. All of this, The shifting sand and the shallow water, the humid summers, the limited soil, the productive sea, the neighbouring nations with their own agendas and their own knowledge, was the reality waiting beneath the optimistic reports that had circulated in London. Not a hostile world exactly, but an honest one. A place that would reward attention and patience and genuine adaptation, and that would quietly, methodically punish the absence of those things. When the first serious English attempt finally set out in 1585, it was sailing toward that complicated reality with a head full of very different images. Reports of gentle climates, friendly people, and easy wealth had been copied, embellished, and passed around long enough that they had taken on a kind of solidity in London. You could almost feel the warmth of the Carolina sun in a cold English tavern if you listened to the right man talk about it. The expedition that left that spring was not, in any simple sense, a group of families looking for a new home. It was closer to a military outpost crossed with a business venture, funded under Sir Walter Raleigh's patent, backed by investors who expected profit, and commanded on the ground by men whose instincts had been shaped by war. The fleet itself was impressive for a first try, around 7 ships, several hundred men, soldiers, sailors, craftsmen, a handful of gentlemen, and crucially, a few people who had already crossed the Atlantic and come back. Among them were 2 Algonquian-speaking men from the region, Manteo of Croatoan and Cittie of Roanoke, who had travelled to England on an earlier reconnaissance voyage and were now being brought back as guides, interpreters, and, whether they had truly agreed to it or not, living proof that this new world could be reached and touched. At the top of the colonial hierarchy was Ralph Lane, appointed governor of the planned settlement. Above him, though not intending to stay, was Sir Richard Grenville, a hard-edged sea captain and privateer charged with getting the men there, establishing a foothold, and then returning to England for more support. Hovering in the background was another figure, Philip Amadas, and Arthur Barlow's earlier glowing reports, written a few years before after a much shorter visit. Words on paper that had helped convince everyone that this could work. From the very beginning, the 1585 voyage carried attention inside it. Was this a scouting mission, a trading post, a privateering base to raid Spanish shipping, or the seed of a permanent colony? Different men on the ships gave different answers to that question. They may not have realized yet how much that ambiguity mattered. They reached the Outer Banks in midsummer, after the Atlantic crossing and the inevitable storms and delays. They found, much as the earlier reconnaissance had, that getting past the barrier islands into the safer waters of the Sounds demanded patience and luck. One of their ships, the Tiger, grounded on a shoal and damaged much of its food supply. Barrels of meal and provisions soaked with seawater, spoiled or lost. An accident born of sandbars and shifting channels, but one that quietly altered the colony's odds before the men had even stepped fully onto shore. Still, at first contact the mood was cautiously hopeful. The English had an advantage they rarely enjoyed in later ventures, faces the local people recognised. Manteo and Cittie could explain who these newcomers were, at least in broad strokes. They could say, "These are the men I went away with. These are the ships I saw before." That kind of continuity matters. It can turn complete strangers into something slightly less alarming. The first meetings with nearby Secatan and Croatoan communities were, in many ways, ritualized. Gift exchanges, food brought to the newcomers, English trinkets and tools offered in return, copper kettles, iron knives, cloth. Things that were genuinely useful, but whose long-term costs and benefits nobody could yet calculate. Hospitality was extended, but it was not unconditional. In indigenous politics, generosity is often the first move in a relationship that will later be assessed, renegotiated, or withdrawn. Lane and Grenville, for their part, were weighing their own calculations. They had been told that this coast could serve as a base to intercept Spanish treasure fleets. They had been told that there was, somewhere inland, a city of gold, or at least rich copper mines, based on garbled rumours filtered through multiple languages. They measured the harbours, tested the soils, noted where corn was grown and how. But they also took hostages when they felt it necessary. They burned at least one town's granaries when they suspected theft. Their conception of diplomacy had sharp edges. In the middle of all this stood Manteo and Cittie, occupying roles that were both powerful and precarious. As interpreters, they could enable understanding, but they could just as easily shape it. colouring what was said and what was heard. Every translation involves choices. How much do you soften an insult? How directly do you relay a threat? In a world where one misunderstood word could mean war, these choices mattered. Manteo seems, from the English accounts, to have remained inclined toward cooperation. He guided them, pointed out resources, helped smooth over early frictions. Wanchizi, by contrast, became increasingly distrustful of the English and of how they were using his presence. By the time the 1585 colony was established on Roanoke, he had withdrawn from close contact and returned to his own people. Two men, two different readings of the newcomers, two different futures branching quietly away from each other. Lane's men built a fort on the northern end of Roanoke Island. Earthworks, palisades, a defensible position looking across the Sound. It was meant to be temporary, a first footprint. But as weeks stretched into months, it became clear that this temporary arrangement was turning into the whole plan. Planting of English crops was limited. Hunters relied heavily on game and on food acquired from nearby indigenous settlements. The colonists' ability to provision themselves was fragile, and they knew it. At first, the English and their indigenous neighbours seemed to manage a workable, if uneasy, exchange. Corn and fish and venison in return for cloth, metal tools, occasional help in conflict with the rival groups. But layered underneath the daily trading were very different understandings of what was being promised. For the local Algonquian-speaking peoples, sharing food in a year of relative plenty did not necessarily imply that the same generosity would be extended in a year of drought, especially if outsiders had shown themselves to be unpredictable. For Lane and his men, accustomed to European feudal obligations, gift-giving could be read as tribute, a sign of submission. When the flow of corn slowed, they interpreted it not as rational caution in a tightening year, but as treachery. This misalignment deepened as environmental pressure increased. Tree ring data from the region suggests that the late 1580s coincided with one of the worst droughts in centuries. Rains faltered, harvests shrank. The careful balance indigenous communities had developed between fishing, hunting and agriculture came under stress. In such a year, surplus becomes scarcity very quickly. Every basket of corn given away was a basket that might not be there in winter. Lane saw it differently. With his own supplies already compromised by the shipwreck provisions and by poor planning, he began to suspect that local leaders were deliberately starving the English, perhaps to force their departure or weaken their hand. His suspicion focused on a prominent Secatan leader, the English called Wingana, who later took the name Pemsapan. Wingana/Pemsapan occupied a complicated position long before the English arrived. He was balancing relationships with neighbouring groups, managing his own people's security, and now trying to decide how much these strange armed visitors might be used as allies or needed to be contained as threats. At certain points, he seems to have explored the possibility of directing English aggression toward his rivals. At others, he considered withdrawing cooperation altogether. From Lane's perspective, these shifting positions looked like plots. He heard rumours, some reliable, some perhaps born of fear, that Pemsapan was planning to cut off food supplies permanently, to incite other groups against the English, maybe even to attack the fort. The incomplete channels of communication turned possibilities into certainties in his mind. Here the role of interpreters becomes especially sharp. Messages were carried back and forth by men whose loyalties and fears were mixed. Subtle hedging in an Algonquian phrase might be rendered as something much more definitive in English. A cautious statement about moving people away from an area of conflict could arrive in Lane's ears as decisive preparation for war. By June 1586, Lane had convinced himself that a preemptive strike was necessary. He organised a small force using the pretext of a visit and launched a surprise attack on Pemsapan and his followers on Roanoke Island. In the confrontation that followed, Pemsapan was killed. The English accounts linger on the tactical success. What they do not fully grasp is the deeper cost. In the indigenous world of the Carolina Sounds, this killing was not just the removal of one leader. It was a violent rupture of relationship, a clear signal that the newcomers were willing to use lethal force against those who had fed them, traded with them, tried, in various ways, to fit them into an already existing political landscape. Whatever margin of trust remained with many neighbouring groups narrowed sharply after that day. The immediate practical consequence was straightforward. Food became harder to obtain. Allies became more cautious. The sense of being surrounded by a landscape of potential friends shifted toward the feeling of being stranded in hostile territory. The fragile network that had been keeping the colony afloat began to fray. Only days after Pemmisapan's killing, an English fleet under Sir Francis Drake appeared offshore. Drake was returning from raiding Spanish possessions in the Caribbean and stopped at Roanoke to offer assistance. He provided supplies, offered to carry messages, even suggested relocating the colonists to another site. But a storm damaged some of his ships and ruined part of the stores meant for the colony. The pattern repeated: opportunity, undermined by weather and bad luck. Faced with dwindling food, souring relations with their indigenous neighbours, and no clear idea when more support might arrive from England, Lane and most of his men made a decision that would echo through every later attempt. They accepted Drake's offer of passage and abandoned the fort in June 1586, less than a year after it had been built. They left behind a few small tokens and perhaps, depending on which account one follows, 1 or 2 men to keep a nominal English presence. They also left behind a set of impressions. For the people of Roanoke, Secretan, Croatoan and beyond, the English were now known quantities, unpredictable, sometimes generous, sometimes violently reactive, dependent on local food, and capable of killing a major leader in a moment of fear. For Raleigh and his backers in London, the report that filtered back was more ambiguous. The land was rich in resources, the harbours potentially useful, the indigenous peoples described in that familiar mix of admiration and condescension. The failure was framed not as a reason to abandon the project, but as a reason to try again, this time with a different strategy. And this is where the first missteps of 1585 matter so deeply for what came after. The next colony, the one that would vanish and leave only a word carved into wood, would not be a military garrison of soldiers and privateers. It would be families, women and children included, sent into a landscape already shaped by memories of scarcity, betrayal, and a leader's blood on the sand. In London, the lesson many people chose to draw from Lane's grim reports was not that Roanoke was impossible, but that the wrong kind of colony had been sent. Soldiers and privateers, the argument went, brought war with them wherever they went. What the venture needed now was stability, roots, people who thought in terms of years and harvests instead of raids and seasons. So the idea shifted. On paper, at least, the next attempt would not be a rough garrison on a contested island. It would be the Cittie of Raleigh, a planted English town on the Chesapeake, where earlier reconnaissance suggested deeper harbours, more fertile land, and perhaps friendlier politics. A place, its backers hoped, where families could grow, where children could be born who had never known any other home. That detail mattered. Women and children changed the mental map of a colony. A man leaving England with a sword and a musket can tell himself he is on an adventure. A woman boarding a ship while carrying a child or already pregnant is making an entirely different kind of wager. She's not just crossing an ocean, she's placing the future that will come after her in a land she's never seen. Into this new plan stepped John White. White had already been part of the 1585 voyage, not as a commander but as an artist and observer. He had sketched the coastline, drawn plants and animals, painted watercolours of Algonquian towns and people. His surviving images are still some of the most detailed visual records of that world, before it was heavily reshaped by English colonisation. Because of this work, and because he had at least seen Roanoke and its surroundings with his own eyes, he became appealing as a leader for the next attempt. Raleigh named him governor of the new Cittie of Raleigh, with a council to assist him. But in many ways, White was an unusual choice. He was not a hardened soldier like Lane, nor a blunt privateer like Grenville. He was, by training, someone who watched and recorded, someone who put things on paper. That temperament would later show up in how he described what happened, and how much he blamed, and how much he regretted. The group that gathered for the 1587 voyage looked very different from the first attempt. This time there were around 115 colonists, and among them were entire families, husbands and wives, children, young couples, a few single men, people with crafts, with skills needed for a settlement meant to endure, bricklayers, carpenters, farmers, a handful of gentlemen, and a larger handful of people who simply intended to become something new on the other side of the ocean. One of those families included White's own daughter, Eleanor, and her husband, Ananias Dare. Eleanor was young, newly married, already expecting a child as she boarded the ship. Her decision to go says something about the mood among at least some of the colonists. They were not all desperate or tricked. Many had been persuaded that this was a genuine chance at land, status, and a different life than the crowded, stratified world they were leaving. It is easy, lying in bed centuries later, to reduce these people to names in a record. But if you linger with them for a moment, you can imagine their quieter preparations, the practical bundles of clothing and tools, the small personal items tucked away, a cherished book, a piece of jewellery, a family token, the conversations about what lay ahead, the stories told to children who had no sense of Atlantic distance, only the vague promise of a place where their parents might not be tenants but owners. They sailed in May 1587 under the command of Simon Fernandes, a Portuguese pilot who had worked with the English before. His job was to get them to the right stretch of coast, then help move them safely through the treacherous inlets toward their intended destination on the Chesapeake. That, at least, was the theory. The Atlantic crossing this time was relatively swift. By late July they were in sight of the Outer Banks again, those same long ribbons of sand that had defeated and damaged ships before. And here, before they had even fully arrived, the colony's path began to bend away from the original plan. White expected Fernandes to carry the settlers northward, past Roanoke, and help find and sound the harbours in the Chesapeake region. Fernandes, however, was a privateer at heart. He wanted to be free for raiding and prize-taking in the profitable Caribbean and Spanish lanes before the season slipped away. The longer he lingered in the shallow, shifting coastal waters of the Carolina Sounds, the greater the risk to his ships and his profits. According to White's later account, a sharp disagreement followed. White pressed for the agreed destination. Fernandes insisted it was too dangerous, that the shoals and inlets would wreck his vessels, that this landing at Roanoke would be to your great contentment. In the end, Fernandes held the power. He controlled the ships, he controlled the supplies, he landed the colonists at Roanoke Island and made it clear he did not intend to take them further. So a colony designed for the Chesapeake suddenly found itself deposited in a place already carrying the weight of the 1585 attempt, a place where Lane's fort still stood, where Pemasapan's killing was still in living memory among the surrounding communities. When the new settlers went ashore, they discovered signs that Lane's men had indeed left in haste. The fort was weathered but standing, its earthworks and palisades still faintly outlining an English footprint on the northern tip of the island. Scattered about were a few bones, some ruined tools, a trunk with mouldy books and papers. The sense of stepping into someone else's unfinished story must have been strong. Yet this same discovery also brought a peculiar kind of comfort. There were walls to mend instead of build from scratch. There were shallow wells that could be cleaned, ground cleared for houses and gardens. In the logic of survival, inheriting a fort, even an unlucky one, was better than sleeping in open camps while a new site was hacked out of the forest. The new colonists quickly set about repairing and expanding the settlement. Houses were marked out, gardens planned. The idea of the Cittie of Raleigh was quietly transferred in their minds from the Chesapeake to this more familiar island. Paper plans yield to sand and soil. Maps drawn in London meet the reality of wind and tide. For a group with limited choices, Roanoke was now home. In this early phase, one of the most important tasks was to rebuild relationships with nearby indigenous communities, or at least test whether that was possible. Manteo, the Croatoan man who had remained broadly aligned with the English during the earlier voyage, reappears in the records here as a crucial figure again. He helped White seek out local leaders, explain that this was a new group, not Lane's soldiers returned. He guided them to Croatoan Island for food and conversation, trying to thread a narrow path between past resentment and potential future alliance. The emotional stakes within the colony itself climbed another step in August, when Eleanor Dare went into labour. On August 18th, 1587, in one of the small, hastily finished houses within the fort, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter. They named her Virginia Dare, after the larger region the English now like to call Virginia in honour of Queen Elizabeth. According to English accounts, she was the first child of English parents known to have been born in this part of the Americas. Births are ordinary in one sense. They happen everywhere in every time, but context can make them feel like omens. For these colonists, Virginia's arrival seemed like a sign that their venture was more than a precarious trading post. A baby wrapped in linen inside wooden walls on a distant island made the idea of an enduring English presence tangible, in a way no royal patent or investment scheme ever could. One can imagine how the colony's mood might have tilted around that moment. There was probably fear, of course. Childbirth in the late 16th century was dangerous. But when mother and child survived, there would have been relief, then a kind of quiet celebration. Voices lowered out of respect and exhaustion. Someone passing around a drink. Neighbours stepping in to help with water, with food, with the simple tasks that surround new life. Virginia Dare became a symbol almost immediately, at least in English minds. If a child could be born here and live, perhaps others would follow. Perhaps in a generation there would be no more talk of returning home, because home would be this island, these sounds and marshes and distant pines. Within the broader project, her birth also served as a message to investors and courtiers far away. News of a healthy English infant born in Virginia suggested that the land was not only habitable, but suitable for family life. It hinted at a future in which English customs, language and inheritance laws would take root across the ocean, carried forward by children who learned to walk on sandy soil rather than cobbled London streets. For a brief window in late summer 1587, it must have felt inside that little community as though the story of Roanoke might yet bend toward quiet success. The memory of Lane's violent year still lingered in the surrounding woods and in the minds of indigenous neighbours, but within the palisade gardens were being planned, houses repaired, and a newborn child slept. Hope, for the moment, outweighed the unease, but hope alone could not fill empty granaries or conjure ships out of the horizon. Even as the colonists celebrated Virginia's birth, a harder calculation was pressing in on John White and his council. The supplies they had brought were finite. Their crops, planted late and in unfamiliar soil, were uncertain. Their dependence on outside support had not vanished just because a baby had been born inside the fort. Soon, the governor who had come to lead a permanent settlement would face a decision that ran against every instinct of a father and a grandfather, whether to stay with his family on this fragile patch of English ground, or to leave them behind and sail back across the ocean in search of help that might not come in time. Food was the most urgent problem, and it is worth lingering with that for a moment. The ships had brought flour, dried peas, salted meat, beer, and other stores, meant to bridge the gap between arrival and the first successful harvests. But the crossing had taken time, some barrels had spoiled, some provisions had been eaten along the way, and what remained now had to be stretched not for a garrison of a few dozen soldiers, but for more than 100 mouths, including pregnant women, nursing mothers, and small children whose bodies burned through calories quickly. Roanoke Island itself was not naturally generous. It offered fish, shellfish, some game in the surrounding woods, and whatever could be coaxed from hastily turned soil. The colonists planted, of course, peas, perhaps some grains, maybe kitchen herbs brought from home, but the timing was off. Late summer plantings in a climate they did not yet understand could not be relied on to see them through winter. Beyond food, they needed tools that wore out faster than many in London had probably imagined. Axes dulled and broke when swung against unfamiliar hardwoods. Nails were used and reused, rope frayed, clothing tore in the work of building houses and clearing ground. Even something as simple as a few extra iron hoops for barrels could mean the difference between being able to preserve a catch of fish or watching it rot in the heat. They also needed defences, not just in the abstract military sense, but as a kind of psychological shelter. The palisade around Lane's old fort could be patched, raised, and strengthened. Firing steps could be improved, watchposts established. In a landscape where memories of sudden violence were fresh, walls were more than wood. They were a way to sleep at night. All of this was possible, in theory, if there was enough time, enough labour, and at least a thin trickle of support from across the sea. But the settlers did not arrive in an empty land, and time was not the only thing in short supply. Trust was even scarcer. Lane's year on Roanoke had left a trail that could not be swept away by simply declaring this a different kind of colony. The killing of Pemmisapan, the burning of fields, the rough treatment of some communities and the favour shown to others, these things had rearranged alliances and suspicions all up and down the Sounds. Some villages that had once traded with the English now saw them as a potential threat. Others, who had been enemies of Pemmisapan, might have viewed the newcomers as possible tools or allies. But even that kind of interest carried its own dangers. Being drawn into local rivalries could mean inheriting someone else's wars. Manteo tried, once again, to stand in the narrow space between worlds. He took messages, he interpreted, He explained, as far as we can tell, that this group meant to plant and stay, that they were not Lane's hard-handed soldiers come back for more raids. His very presence with them was, in itself, a message to nearby leaders that not all relationships with the English had to end in blood. There were small signs that this diplomacy had some effect. The colonists were able to visit Croatoan Island and receive food, corn, perhaps, and other staples, when their own stocks ran low. They walked in villages where people remembered the first English ships, where children might have stared at the newcomers' clothes and tools with the same mixture of curiosity and caution as before. But in other directions the air remained tense. Rumours moved along the waterways. White heard reports that some of Lane's men, who had been separated from the main group before Drake's ships arrived the year before, had been killed by local people. He worried that those killings and Lane's earlier actions had turned potential neighbours into enemies. In that kind of atmosphere, even a simple request for corn could be misread. Was it a plea from a struggling settlement, or the opening move in a renewed attempt to dominate and extract? For communities who had already seen disease arrive with European visitors and had watched violence follow in their wake, caution was understandable. Inside the palisade, these external uncertainties met the internal arithmetic of dwindling supplies. White and the council began to reckon how long their remaining food would last at various ration levels. They weighed the risk of leaning more heavily on indigenous neighbours for grain against the risk of hunger and resentment if those neighbours felt pressured. Underlying all of this was a basic structural problem. The colony had been founded on the assumption that resupply from England would be regular. Ships would come with more food, more tools, more people. They would bring livestock, perhaps, or at least the means to obtain it. If that chain held, the fragile first years could be bridged. If it broke, everything else became a race against hunger and isolation. By late summer 1587, it was becoming clear that the chain was already fraying. Fernandez had made it plain that he wanted to leave quickly and turn to more profitable work. There was no extra vessel waiting in the wings, no guarantee that another English ship would simply appear on the horizon at the right moment. So the conversation turned, almost inevitably, to the unthinkable, sending someone back. It was not at first a question of who would go, but of whether anyone could afford to leave at all. Every able-bodied person was needed. More hands meant more food gathered, more houses built, more watch kept. To spare a man across the ocean was to accept a weaker settlement in the critical months ahead, but resupply was not going to come on its own. Someone had to sail back to England, explain the situation, press Raleigh and his backers for more support, and shepherd a relief voyage back across the Atlantic before the colony's margin for error vanished. In such a small community, the governor was not an abstract figure. John White was a working member of the settlement, a father, a grandfather. He carried water, helped plan gardens, worried about his daughter's health like any other parent would. The notion that he might leave his family and neighbours in a half-finished fort on a contested island did not sit easily with him. According to his own later account, White resisted. He argued that others could go in his place, that his duty was to stay with the people he had been appointed to govern. But the colonists, his council, and then a broader group saw things differently. A petition was drawn up, urging him to return to England on their behalf. In choosing White, they were making a calculated decision. He knew the backers in London personally. He had Raleigh's ear, at least more than an anonymous colonist would. He had already proven himself as an observer and recorder, someone who could lay out their situation in persuasive detail. If anyone could turn their precarious reality into an argument that might move money and ships, it was likely to be him. There was also, perhaps, a subtler consideration. A governor asking for help for his own daughter and granddaughter, as well as for his fellow colonists, might speak with a kind of urgency that no hired agent could match. His plea could not easily be dismissed as an exaggeration from afar. His family's fate was bound to whatever answer England gave. At the same time, no one in that meeting could have been entirely sure what White's absence would mean on the ground. Leadership would fall to those remaining, disagreements might sharpen. If hostility flared with nearby communities, there would be one fewer experienced negotiator to try to cool it. Still, the logic of survival pointed in one direction. Without substantial reinforcement, the colony would eventually run out of something essential: food, tools, powder, perhaps even the will to stay. With it, they might yet become the thriving Cittie of Raleigh that had been promised, even if its location had shifted. Before White could leave, they had to decide on something else. What should happen if events forced the colonists to move? No one wanted to abandon the fort lightly. Buildings, gardens, and cleared ground represented weeks of hard labour. But they had already seen how quickly circumstances could change, how one storm, one crop failure, or one violent encounter could make an island feel suddenly untenable. So they agreed on a plan, as far as we can reconstruct it from later testimony. If they were compelled by famine or danger to relocate, they would remove to a place they all knew by name, Croatoan. Croatoan Island, home to Manteo's people, lay to the south, closer to the open ocean. It had long been a point of contact between indigenous communities and the English. It offered resources, and it stood in a different web of local politics than Roanoke. To move there would be to lean more heavily into alliance with Manteo's kin, to trade some isolation for a different kind of dependency. To make sure that any relief expedition could find them, the colonists and White settled on a simple signalling system. If they left Roanoke, they would carve the name of their new destination in a prominent place, a tree, a post, some obvious surface within the fort. If they were in distress when they left, they would add a cross or other agreed-upon mark to show that danger, not ordinary choice, had driven them away. It was a small, almost fragile plan, resting on a series of assumptions: that White would reach England safely, that Raleigh would respond, that war or weather would not interfere, that ships would find the right stretch of coast again, and that those ships would know to look for a single carved word. When you think about it in the quiet of a late hour, you can feel how slender that thread really was. An ocean on one side, a complicated, sometimes hostile landscape on the other, in between a handful of marks on wood, and the hope that someone would be alive to read them. In the end, White agreed. Perhaps he saw no other choice. Perhaps he convinced himself that a brief absence would be repaid many times over in the supplies and people he could bring back. He boarded the ship with the other departing crew, carrying with him what records he could and the petitions of those who stayed. On the shore, his family and neighbours watched the vessel work its way through the inlets and out toward the horizon. They could not know what storms or politics would do to delay his return. They only knew that, for now, their link to England had been reduced to one man on one ship, sailing away from the island where everything they owned now stood. Behind them, inside the repaired palisade, the colony turned back to its work, planting, mending, watching the tree line and the water, trying to stretch hope and remaining provisions until that fragile thread pulled taut again. They expected months. What they received was years. In another world the timing might have worked. White would have reached England, found Raleigh, laid out the colony's needs, and been bundled back onto a relief ship within a season. The Atlantic was long, but not endless. A determined state and a handful of well-funded merchants could have bridged it with regular sails. But the Roanoke colonists had chosen a moment in history when England's attention was about to be dragged somewhere else entirely. In the autumn and winter of 1587, as White tried to make his way from the Western Ocean back into the tight circles of London politics and money, rumours were hardening into certainties. Spain, the great Catholic power of Europe, was preparing an enormous fleet. Philip II meant to bring England to heel, punish it for privateering against his treasure ships, for supporting rebels in the Netherlands, for breaking with Rome. The word that would come to dominate English conversations for the next 2 years was simple: Armada. For people in London, the American experiments had always been a mixture of adventure, potential profit, and national prestige. A colony in the New World might one day bring in timber, wine, silk, or at the very least harass Spanish interests. But when faced with the possibility of a Spanish invasion, that far-off settlement on a barrier island became something else, a distraction. Ships that might have carried grain and tools to Roanoke were suddenly needed closer to home. Hulls had to be scraped and re-rigged for war. Cannon were in high demand. Experienced captains, the same kind who knew the Atlantic crossings, were now being courted by the Crown to patrol the Channel and join the defence. Raleigh himself was no longer just a visionary of overseas empires. He was a courtier with his own neck to think about, his fortunes tied to Elizabeth's survival and England's independence. In that kind of atmosphere, asking investors to risk a valuable ship for a relief voyage, through waters where Spanish patrols and privateers might be lurking, was a much harder sell. White did try. In early 1588, he was involved in outfitting a small relief fleet. 2 vessels were gathered, not the grand, well-armed escorts you would want in dangerous seas, but what could be scraped together amid growing tensions: smaller, privately owned ships, part merchant, part opportunist. They set out, and almost immediately the larger currents of history caught them. Off the Iberian coast they encountered a French privateer. In peacetime this might have been an annoyance, a skirmish quickly broken off. In the charged atmosphere of the late 1580s, with tempers high and guns ready, encounters at sea were rarely gentle. A fight broke out. The English ships were damaged. Supplies meant for the colony were lost or plundered. Whatever calculations had been made in London did not include the cost of limping across the ocean in battered hulls, with reduced food and powder. The captain turned back. For White, that reversal must have been more painful than the initial departure from Roanoke. He knew, now, that the colony he had left was facing a second winter. He had, in essence, nothing to send them but silence. And then, as if to seal the Atlantic off even more firmly, 1588 turned fully into the year of the Armada. The Spanish fleet sailed. The English mustered everything that could float. Merchantmen were pressed into service, harbour defences shored up, beacons readied along the coast. In that feverish summer, the question of a small, precarious settlement on the far side of the world slipped well down the list of priorities. Even when the Armada was broken, scattered by English fire and North Atlantic storms, relief did not follow immediately for Roanoke. The victory that English propagandists would later describe as almost miraculous had its own economic aftershocks. Ships had been damaged or lost. Crews were exhausted. Credit networks were strained by the cost of war. There is a kind of quiet irony here. One of the main arguments for English colonies in the New World was that they would strengthen England for exactly these kinds of confrontations, provide bases, resources, and power. But in the short term, the threat of Spain did the opposite. It pulled ships, men, and money back toward the Channel, leaving Roanoke exposed. Meanwhile, on the other side of that ocean, there was no way for the colonists to know any of this. They had watched White's ship shrink and disappear beyond the inlets, trusting in the rough schedule of the Atlantic, a crossing westward, some months in England, a crossing back. They could not see the French privateer's sails. They could not hear the cannons in the English Channel. The only sound that reached them was the wind off the sounds and the waves on the shoals. So the first winter must have been lived with a certain grim optimism. If White made good speed, if Raleigh pushed hard, perhaps a ship would appear in the spring. The settlers rationed their stores accordingly, passing out flour and peas, saving powder when they could, making do with fish and whatever they could trade for with their indigenous neighbours. Rationing changes more than menus. It creeps into tempers. A slightly smaller portion of bread can make a long day of labour feel unbearable. Children cry more easily. Old resentments over who works hardest, who gets the last of the salt meat, who seems to receive better treatment from Manteo's kin, can sharpen. Inside the palisade, sickness would have been an almost constant companion, not necessarily in the dramatic forms that make it into history books, but as low, wearing things, fevers that came and went, stomachs unsettled by new foods, infections from small cuts, cold air leaking through imperfect daub and wattle. Morale in such a place is a fragile ecosystem. Some evenings may have been almost peaceful. Cool air, a shared pot of stew, someone telling stories of England by the fire. Other nights, every creak in the darkness, every distant shout from the woods could trigger a surge of fear. As the months stretched on and no mast appeared on the eastern horizon, decisions that had felt hypothetical when White left began to take on weight. How long do you wait exactly for a ship that may or may not be coming? At what point does planning for survival mean loosening your grip on the idea of being an English outpost on Roanoke Island and starting to consider yourself something else? The landscape itself nudged the colonists toward these questions. Roanoke was never the obvious place for a permanent town. It was low, vulnerable to storms, and only modestly productive. Inland, along the rivers and sounds, there were richer soils, long-established indigenous towns, and more reliable freshwater sources. South lay Croatoan, familiar through Manteo, somewhat safer politically in the wake of Lane's violence. Staying meant clinging to the original plan. Hold this particular patch of ground until England remembered them. Moving meant gambling on better food access, stronger alliances, or a more defensible position, even if that somehow increased their distance, practically and symbolically, from the people who had sent them. If relations around Roanoke remained strained, the pressure to shift could have been intense. A bad harvest, a failed fishing season, or a breakdown in trade with neighbouring villages might make the island feel suddenly untenable. Stories from Manteo or other visitors about more abundant fields elsewhere would have been tempting. There are also the subtler pressures that come with prolonged uncertainty. People begin to imagine futures beyond the horizon that was first promised to them. A man who has watched 2 winters pass without a relief ship might quietly decide that his children's best chance lies not in a hypothetical English reinforcement, but in putting down roots alongside local communities. Some may have pushed for an inland move, up the Albemarle or toward the Chewan or Roanoke rivers, places where English expeditions had heard of large towns and good land. Others may have preferred Croatoan, familiar, reachable by canoe, anchored by Manteo's status and kinship. None of this required a single dramatic vote. It could have unfolded slowly, over seasons, a group going to plant a satellite field somewhere more fertile, a few families spending more time in a friendly village, temporary shelters becoming more permanent. In a small, stressed community, even modest departures can tip the balance, leaving fewer hands to maintain the fort, fewer eyes for night watch. And always, somewhere in the background of their thinking, there would have been that agreement with White. If we leave, we will carve our destination. Croatoan, spelled out where a searching governor might see it. A cross, if danger forced the move. That plan, simple as it was, had to compete with the complicated realities of daily survival. If the decision to relocate was gradual, would anyone feel the moment when the carving should be made? If danger came suddenly, an attack, a fire, a storm, would they have time to remember, to stop in the rush and cut letters into wood? From England's side the delay lengthened. 1589 brought its own distractions. Talk of follow-up actions against Spain, court intrigues, financial aftershocks. Raleigh's fortunes rose and fell with Elizabeth's favour. Merchants weighed the risks of Atlantic ventures more cautiously now, aware that the sea lanes were not just routes to profit but battlefields. White's appeals did not vanish, but they had to compete with other voices. The colony that had once been the bright Cittie of Raleigh on promotional maps was now, to many in London, an ageing promise, distant, expensive, and perhaps already lost. By the time another expedition was finally mounted in 1590, the Atlantic had been effectively closed to Roanoke for nearly 3 years. On the island, through all those seasons, whatever choices the colonists made, to stay, to shift gradually, to relocate in one decisive move, were made in a kind of informational darkness. They could not know that help had been delayed by foreign fleets and privateering skirmishes. They could only see that no sails were coming, that their tools were wearing thinner, that their children were growing up in a place balanced between 2 worlds. When White's ship at last threaded its way through the dangerous inlets again, it was sailing not just toward a physical island, but toward the accumulation of 3 years' worth of such decisions, taken day by day, under pressures we can outline but never fully reconstruct. What he would find when he stepped ashore was not just an empty settlement, but the trace of how a small community had tried to live in the space between expectation and abandonment. By the time John White finally secured a berth across the ocean, the story of Roanoke, at least in London, had thinned into rumour. To some, the colony was probably already a ghost, a failed venture, one more line in the long ledger of maritime risks. To White, it was something else entirely, a place where his name meant governor, where his daughter's laughter had once echoed between rough timber walls, where his granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in this new world, might still be alive. That difference in perspective matters. For the investors and courtiers he petitioned, Roanoke was an asset. For him, it was a family. In 1590, after years of delay, he managed to join a privateering expedition heading toward the Caribbean. The arrangement was not ideal. The captains were interested in Spanish prizes, not humanitarian missions. Roanoke was at best a sidestop, something to be checked on between more profitable ventures. White had to negotiate even for that. The Atlantic crossing that summer would not have been gentle. Ships crowded with men, provisions calculated more for speed and plunder than comfort, constant watchfulness for sails that might be hostile. White was older now. The optimism of 1587 had been worn down by years of petitioning and disappointment. He knew, as each day passed and the latitude lines crept westward, that he was sailing toward an answer that might already be 3 winters old. When they finally turned north, leaving the warmer Caribbean waters and heading up the coast toward the familiar hazards of the Outer Banks, The mood aboard could not have been simple. The privateer captains had taken their Spanish prizes. Their men would have been eager to get home, their holds newly heavy with stolen goods, their ships perhaps a bit more battered than when they left England. Roanoke was, to them, a detour with uncertain returns. The barrier islands had not grown any friendlier in White's absence. Shifting shoals, tricky inlets, sudden storms. This was a coast that demanded respect. In 1590, as in 1587 and 1585, bigger ships hesitated to push in too close. A grounding here could ruin a voyage entirely. So once again, final approach was done by smaller craft. Ships' boats and pinnaces, men bending to oars, eyes scanning for breakers in the half-light. Accounts suggest the first attempt to reach the island was thwarted by bad weather and dangerous seas. A boat overturned in the surf. Men died within sight of the land they were trying to reach. For White, watching from the larger vessel, those losses would have been twofold. He saw men drown who had agreed, however grudgingly, to help him, and he saw in the roaring surf a reminder of how fragile any foothold on this coast really was. When the weather finally eased enough to risk another landing, they approached more cautiously. Imagine the scene as the pinnace glides toward the shore near the northern end of Roanoke Island, the sky perhaps overcast, light softened, low dunes, familiar tree line, the outline of the settlement's palisade just visible behind the vegetation. 3 years had passed, but the basic geography was unchanged. White knew this shoreline. He had walked it, sketched it, watched his colonists unload here. The questions as the boat's keel scraped sand would have been immediate and sharp. Would smoke be rising from hearth fires inside the fort? Would figures appear along the palisade, waving, calling out? Or would there be only the hush of wind through the grass and the sound of water lapping the beach? The party that stepped ashore moved toward the settlement with a blend of caution and urgency. This was not just a reunion, it was a foray into the unknown. The captains could not be sure who might be watching from the woods. Friends, enemies, or no one at all. White, by his own account, urged them on. As they came within clear view of the site, the first impression was stark. No movement, no children darting between houses, no smoke curling up from cooking fires, no dogs barking from within the palisade. Just the wooden fort, the outlines of houses, the familiar shapes of English construction, sitting in a kind of suspended stillness. Approaching the gate, they found it closed, the palisade intact but weathered. This matters. A settlement overrun by attackers often shows its story in broken walls, charred beams, signs of violence. Here, at least from a distance, the defences still stood. No immediate scars of war. When they broke through and stepped inside, the quiet deepened. The houses were there, but open to the air. Roofs sagging or missing in places, doors gone or hanging crooked. Grass and undergrowth had begun to creep in around thresholds, reclaiming space that had been swept and trodden by dozens of feet. But there was something else to notice. Absence with a kind of order. The heavy chests and furniture were gone. Tools, clothing, weapons, things that could be carried and used, were not scattered about as if dropped in panic. Instead, they were largely missing, taken away. What remained tended to be the things you leave when you have time to decide. Heavier items, things too bulky or too marginal to justify space in a canoe or on a long march. Some small pieces of brass or iron lay hidden in the grass. A few cannons had been buried, an odd detail suggesting either a plan to retrieve them or an attempt to keep them from enemy hands. More telling than what was left behind was what was not found at all. There were no bodies, no shallow graves hastily dug within the fort, no bones scattered in and around the houses, no obvious signs of a massacre, no smashed skulls, no blood-stained earth, no overturned furniture lying where it had been flung in a last struggle. The scene did not read as a sudden destruction. It read as a departure, not necessarily an orderly, cheerful one. People can leave under pressure, with fear at their backs, and still take the time to grab their tools and personal treasures. But the lack of carnage suggested that, whatever had happened, it was not a simple story of an attack that erased everyone in one blow. For White, walking through these abandoned spaces, every object, or lack of an object, would have had a personal echo. He had known the people who lived here, their temperaments, their plans. He had seen where his daughter and son-in-law kept their things. Somewhere in this emptiness, His granddaughter had taken her first steps. Now, instead of family, he had clues. One of the most important agreements made in 1587 had been about communication in case of relocation. If the colonists were forced to move, they would carve the name of their new destination where White could easily see it. If they were under duress, attacked or compelled against their will, they would add a cross, a sign of distress. That simple code was White's lifeline. It meant that even if he never met the colonists face to face, he might at least know where they had gone and under what conditions. So as he moved through the settlement, eyes scanning timber and trees, he was not just grieving, he was searching. Outside the palisade on a sturdy post he found one clear carving, 3 letters cut into the wood, CRO. Not the full word he had expected, but an unmistakable beginning. Deeper into the site on a tree there was more. A word fully spelled out, cut with care into living wood rather than scratched hastily onto bark. Croatoan. We will dwell on that word in the next section. Here, what matters is what was not beside it. No cross, no Maltese-like sign, no simple addition that would have turned this into an emergency message. According to the plan, the lack of that mark implied that the move, if this was indeed a record of their destination, had not been made under direct attack, forced by hunger perhaps, or by fraying diplomacy, but not literally at sword point in that moment. For White this must have been a narrow ray of hope, cutting through everything else he saw. His colonists had left, but perhaps they had left alive, in enough control of their circumstances to keep to the agreed signal. At the same time, the condition of the fort told him that this was not a recent departure. Weathering on the timbers, the degree of overgrowth, the way certain structures had sagged, these were not the marks of weeks, but of seasons. Whatever move had been made to Croatoan, it had likely occurred long before his sails reappeared on the horizon. There was another small, bitter twist. White and the captains did consider sailing on to Croatoan Island to investigate. It was within reach, known from earlier voyages, and now clearly flagged in this carved message. But weather and the priorities of the voyage intervened again. Storms threatened. The privateer captains, already impatient with delays that did not bring them profit, were reluctant to risk their ships and prizes in the shoals and shifting inlets any longer. They feared losing anchors, snapping masts, sacrificing everything they had gained for a rescue mission they had never truly signed up for. White argued. He begged. He pointed to the carved word, to the agreement, to the possibility, however faint, that his family and the others were waiting just a few days' sail away. In the end, he lost that argument. The decision was made to turn back toward England. Croatoan would not be visited. The carved clues would be noted, described, then left behind with the empty houses and the silent palisade. So White left Roanoke for the last time with his heart full of unfinished stories. He had come seeking a bustling settlement, or at least remains that could tell him definitively what had happened. Instead, he found something more ambiguous, a place that had been lived in, then carefully, almost deliberately abandoned. The fort stood like an unanswered question. The buried cannon hinted at precaution. The missing cross suggested that whatever forced the colonists to leave did not in that moment feel like immediate annihilation. And on tree and post, carved into the grain of the new world, there was the single piece of concrete evidence that would survive the centuries. A word that pointed somewhere, without explaining what had awaited them when they arrived. A word that kept hope alive and at the same time guaranteed that the mystery would never quite close. Croatoan. Stand for a moment with John White in that abandoned fort and focus on the one thing that was not vague. Not a half-rotted roof, not the angle of a fallen fence post, not a buried cannon whose purpose could be debated. A word, CRO on the post, Croatoan on the tree. In a landscape of absence, those letters were almost shockingly solid. They mattered because they weren't random. Before White had left in 1587, the colonists and their governor had agreed on a simple, almost childlike system, something that didn't require ink, paper, or any fragile tool that could be lost in a storm. If they had to move, they would carve the name of their new location somewhere obvious, a gatepost, a tree, a place White was certain to check. If they were forced to move under attack or taken against their will, they would add a sign beside it, a cross, roughly in the shape of a Maltese cross, a mark that said, in the simplest possible code, "We're not just gone, We're in danger. In a world before radios and signal flares, before you could send a message across an ocean in seconds, this kind of low-tech redundancy was survival strategy. You carve into wood because wood doesn't blow away. It weathers, slowly. Marks sink into the grain, darken, soften at the edges, but they linger. White knew this. He had helped create this code. When he walked into the empty settlement in 1590, he was carrying in his mind a kind of mental checklist. Name carved somewhere, cross carved next to it, destination, condition, 2 pieces of information delivered without words. That's why the discovery of CRO on the post outside the palisade hits with such force in the surviving accounts. It was not just graffiti, it was evidence that the plan had at least been remembered. CRO could have meant several things in English geography. But on this coast, in this context, it pointed in one direction. Croatoan. A second carving deeper in the site made that explicit. White says it was in fair capital letters, which suggests care, time, deliberate strokes of a blade rather than a hurried scratch done while looking over one's shoulder. Again, no cross. That absence has almost as much weight in the narrative as the letters themselves. It implies that, at the moment of carving, the colonists did not consider themselves seized, massacred, or dragged away at sword point. They were going somewhere, and thought of themselves as going there, not simply being taken. To make sense of that, you have to know what Croatoan meant in 1587. It was not just a mysterious word on a tree, it was a place and a people already woven into English experience on this coast. Croatoan Island lay to the south of Roanoke, part of the same string of barrier islands that run along what we now call the Outer Banks. Today, most historians link it to modern Hatteras Island. In the 16th century, Croatoan could refer to both the island and the Algonquian-speaking community that lived there. White and his predecessors had been there before. The 1584 reconnaissance voyage had met friendly people from Croatoan. One of the men they brought back to England, Manteo, came from that community. He had crossed the Atlantic twice, learned English, and served as guide and interpreter in 1585 and 1587. In the 1587 settlement, Manteo was a crucial bridge figure. He had kin at Croatoan, knowledge of the local waters, and some degree of standing in both worlds. Raleigh even had him ceremonially declared Lord of Roanoke and of Dassamonquapeuque, a title that sounds grand to English ears, but sat awkwardly on indigenous political realities. Still, the message was clear. If there was any place nearby where English and native people had at least tried to build a cooperative relationship, it was Croatoan. So when you see Croatoan carved into a tree at an abandoned English fort, the most straightforward reading is also the gentlest. We went to Croatoan, a planned relocation. An intentional move from a precarious, increasingly hostile base at Roanoke to an island where, at least in 1587, they had an ally, or hoped they did. This dovetails with what we know about conditions before White left. Diplomatic relations with some mainland groups had deteriorated badly. Food was scarce. The promise of resupply from England had failed to materialize. Croatoan, with its known harbour and known people, might have seemed like a lifeline. Imagine the calculus inside the fort, somewhere in those 3 empty years. Stay on Roanoke, waiting for sails that never appear, surrounded by communities whose patience has worn thin. Or move to a nearby island inhabited by people with whom you have at least some shared history, where you can fish, plant, and possibly merge your households with theirs. Under those circumstances, carving Croatoan feels less like a code and more like a courtesy. A breadcrumb left for a delayed governor. We've gone where you would expect us to go, but that is only one layer of interpretation. Another possibility is that the carving was not a full explanation, only a fragment of a longer, more complicated story. CRO on the post, Croatoan on the tree, these could have been made at different times by different hands. Perhaps someone began a message that was never finished. Then later another colonist or group carved a fuller note elsewhere. Perhaps the postmarking was meant as a quick signal for anyone approaching from the beach, while the tree carving, tucked slightly farther in, was done when they had more time. Each scenario implies something slightly different about urgency and control. If the move were purely voluntary and hopeful, you might expect more than just a single place name, maybe a date or a second word, upriver or inland. Yet the agreed-upon system, as far as we know from White's account, never specified that level of detail. It was destination plus, if needed, distress mark. Within that narrow code, Croatoan is actually complete. We're also left uncertain about whether the move was meant to be temporary or permanent. Croatoan might have been a staging point, a safe harbour while they waited for white, or a winter refuge from a bad harvest, with plans to return to Roanoke or push deeper inland. The buried cannon at the fort hint at the possibility that they expected to come back for them. You don't bother to conceal heavy artillery unless you think someone someday might dig it up again. In that reading, Croatoan is closer to what we'd now call a forwarding address. For historians and archaeologists, those letters have become both anchor and trap. They anchor discussions because they are specific. There is a known island, a known community, a set of earlier interactions documented in English sources. You can point on a map and say, here is the place the word indicates. They are a trap because later generations have often treated them as more precise than they really are. Some 19th and early 20th century retellings inflate the story. They add details that don't appear in the earliest accounts, crosses that flash and disappear, multiple trees carved with phrases, sinister overtones layered onto a word that, at the time, simply named neighbours and geography. Even the spelling wanders in the record. Croatoan, Croatan, variations in vowels and consonants reflecting the uneven way English writers tried to capture Algonquian sounds on paper. Over time, those small orthographic shifts help detach the word from its original context in readers' minds, turning it from a specific locale into a more ghostly floating symbol. Modern popular culture has pushed that drift even further. Croatoan shows up in fiction, in television, carved into props and whispered like a curse. The carved word becomes less a clue and more a charm, an incantation for disappearance. Yet at its core, in 1590, it seems to have been nothing more and nothing less than an attempt at communication. A group of people, cut off from their promised lifeline, made a decision. They left a sign in the simplest medium available, using the simplest code they had agreed upon. They carved the name of a nearby island where they hoped to find food, allies, or at least a more defensible home. No cross, no explicit cry for help, just a place name, rooted in a local community they had known through one of their own translators. It may have been an act of hope, it may have been a record made under quiet desperation, it may have been both at once. What we can say is that this single word has carried far more weight in the centuries since than its carvers could have imagined. It has become the hinge on which the entire Roanoke story turns, and it leads, almost inevitably, to the next question. If Croatoan was a destination, what happened when the colonists reached it? To follow that trail, we have to leave the empty fort behind and look toward the island and people whose name ended up etched into English memory, one careful letter at a time. If you follow the direction of that carved word, your mind drifts south, down the line of low islands and shifting shoals to where Croatoan lay. Not as a ghost story, as a real place where real people were already living, growing crops, fishing the sounds, watching the seasons turn. Start with the simplest scenario. The colonists, running low on food and allies on Roanoke, decide not to wait any longer for sails on the horizon. They choose instead to move to Croatoan, to people they know by name and face. They would not have arrived as blank strangers. Manteo's ties mattered here. He was not an abstract go-between, but someone with kin at Croatoan, people who had seen him leave with the English and return with them. He had walked both shores of the Atlantic. He spoke enough English to interpret, enough of his own language to explain English intentions and fears. For a desperate group on Roanoke, that kind of bridge could look like salvation. Picture the decision. A meeting inside the palisade, voices low, some urging patience, others pointing out that patience doesn't fill empty bellies. The known safe harbour is not back in England anymore. It's a day's sail away, on an island where they had once been welcomed, where there were fish in the sounds, crops in the ground, and at least the memory of goodwill. Under those conditions, going to Croatoan is not vanishing. It is choosing the most rational survival strategy available. If that happened, what would it actually look like on the ground? Probably not 100 English people marching in a block, planting a second little fort and insisting on English rules. Reality tends to be more complicated, more gradual. Think in terms of households, not headlines. A few families go first, perhaps by boat, those with small children, those closest to Manteo. They arrive at Croatoan and ask, through him, for food, for a place to stay until the next harvest, for space to plant their own small fields nearby. If relations are still friendly, some kind of accommodation is reached. Tents or simple shelters go up at the edge of the existing village. English tools appear beside Algonquian baskets. A week later, more colonists arrive. The separation between English and Croatoan spaces blurs. This is where assimilation stops being a single decision and becomes a process. You can imagine the first nights. English voices clustered together at the fringe of the settlement, praying in a language no one else understands, the smell of familiar pottage mixing with the smoke from Croatoan cooking fires. Children staring at one another across an invisible line of habit and fear, curiosity winning out just a little more each day. Language would have been the first barrier and the first bridge. Algonquian on this coast was not one uniform tongue, but a family of related dialects. The Roanoke colonists had already picked up bits, names for fish, for local plants, for directions along the waterways. Croatoan speech would have been close enough that some words rang familiar. Manteo and perhaps a handful of bilingual intermediaries would carry most of the burden at first, explaining, translating, smoothing over misunderstandings. But children are natural linguists. Within a few seasons, the youngest generation, born or growing up in mixed households, could easily have moved between languages without thinking about it. This is what cultural exchange actually looks like over time. Not formal treaties, but shared words, borrowed recipes, exchanged techniques. English iron axes might have become prized tools in Croatoan hands, reshaping wood faster than stone blades. In return, English farmers would have had to learn how to grow and protect maize, beans and squash in sandy soils, how to time planting by local seasons rather than English calendars, how to read the sky and the water for storms that behave differently than those of the Channel. They would also have learned social rules. Who could fish where? Which plants were sacred or taboo? How food was stored and distributed when winter came. Violating those norms could mean friction, even violence. Respecting them could mean inclusion. Intermarriage lies at the heart of most serious assimilation, not as a romantic flourish, but as an enduring way that groups bind themselves to one another. By 1590, it is entirely plausible that some English women had married Croatoan men, or the reverse, that partnerships had formed out of proximity, necessity, and simple human attachment. Widows and widowers on both sides trying to protect children in a precarious world may have seen such unions as practical and protective. Once that happens, the idea of going back to being purely English begins to dissolve. Children of these unions would have grown up navigating overlapping identities, English names perhaps, or a few English prayers, alongside Algonquian kinship ties, ritual obligations and daily habits. They might have worn English cloth with shell ornaments, eaten bread when wheat was available and maize when it wasn't, listened to tales of London as distant and unreal as myths. This picture, messy, mixed, quietly persistent, is what many historians mean by the Croatoan hypothesis. Not an entire colony swallowed by some supernatural unknown, but a group of Europeans gradually absorbed into an existing indigenous community through dependence, cooperation and family life. Later, English accounts begin to gesture in fragmentary ways towards something like this. 17th century reports from further inland mention native communities whose members were said to have grey or blue eyes, or to know Christian prayers, or to speak a few English words despite living far from the coast. Some writers speculated that these people might be descendants of the Roanoke colonists, carried or migrated inland over the decades. Those reports are tantalizing, but they are also slippery. Descriptions of eye colour can be unreliable, especially when filtered through expectation and hearsay. Blue and grey eyes are not impossible among native populations even without European ancestry, though they would be rare. Early colonists and traders also had a strong incentive to tell stories that linked their current ventures to Raleigh's failed one. Finding descendants of the Lost Colony made for compelling petitions and letters back to investors. Some of these accounts contradict each other. Some were written decades after the events they describe. None of them, on their own, can prove a direct line from specific Roanoke settlers to any particular later community. Archaeology has tried to push beyond rumour and into material traces. On Hatteras Island, widely thought to be the old Croatoan, excavations have turned up intriguing finds. European objects, bits of metal, a gun lock, copper, fragments of ceramics, mixed into layers dated to the early 17th century and associated with native occupation. At first glance, those objects seem like perfect smoking guns, English goods at Croatoan around the right time. What else could they be but the possessions of Roanoke survivors? But evidence has to be handled with care. By the early 1600s, European trade goods were circulating widely along the coast. Items could travel far from their original owners through gift exchange, barter, or spoils of conflict. A single piece of English iron found in a Croatoan context could have been traded 10 times before it was buried. Stratigraphy, the layering of soil and material, can blur over centuries, especially in sandy, storm-prone landscapes like the Outer Banks. A 17th century object might end up near 16th century remains without being directly connected to them. What we can say is that European and native material cultures were interacting on Croatoan Island and nearby long after 1587. The patterns and quantities of finds suggest sustained contact, not a single fleeting raid or shipwreck. Whether that contact included a core group of surviving colonists living out their lives as part of Croatoan households remains an open question. Genetic studies, which sometimes offer answers in other historical mysteries, are not straightforward here either. Centuries of disease, displacement, intermarriage, and forced migration have complicated the genetic landscape of coastal North Carolina. Many descendant communities have faced profound disruptions that make simple lines of ancestry impossible to trace with certainty or fairness. So the Croatoan hypothesis rests, not on one decisive piece of evidence, but on a web of plausibility. We know the colonists planned to signal their destination. We know they carved Croatoan without any distress mark. We know Croatoan was a known, previously friendly place with a bilingual intermediary. We know harsh conditions on Roanoke made relocation logical. We know that later, English goods and English stories appear in native contexts along this same coast. Taken together, these threads sketch a picture that is less dramatic than the word lost suggests, but perhaps more human. Under this interpretation, the colony did not vanish in a single moment of catastrophe. It melted. Edges softened, identities blurred. Over years, the sharp line between English and Croatoan faded into everyday life. Shared work, shared risks, shared children. Disappearance in that sense is not annihilation, it is absorption. The English settlement at Roanoke ceased to exist as an isolated, self-sufficient outpost flying its own flag. But many of the people who had called it home may have continued on, their names unrecorded in English chronicles, their descendants woven invisibly into the fabric of coastal communities. Framed this way, the Croatoan hypothesis is less about a spectacular mystery and more about a quiet, adaptive choice. When the expected rescue did not come from across the ocean, survival may have come from across the Sound, from neighbours whose world was older, whose knowledge of this fragile strip of land was deeper, and who, for a time at least, were willing to share both. Yet even this gentle, plausible story leaves gaps. If assimilation at Croatoan was the beginning of the colony's afterlife, it does not tell us everything about where that blended community might have gone next, or how it weathered the storms, literal and political, that swept the region in the decades that followed. To explore those possibilities, and the more violent alternatives that have been proposed, we have to step back from Croatoan's shoreline and look again at the wider landscape of threat and uncertainty that surrounded Roanoke. Step back from the shoreline and let the map of possibilities widen. Croatoan is one branch on the tree of explanations. Other branches reach inland, upriver, and into darker corners of fear, conflict, starvation, strange fevers, and the long reach of Spain. Start with conflict, because that is often where people's minds go first. The coast around Roanoke was not an empty backdrop waiting for English settlers to walk on stage. It was a region of polities and rivalries, a living political landscape. The Algonquian-speaking world here was divided into different groups and spheres of influence. To the north, the powerful network often called the Powhatan Paramount Chiefdom was still taking shape. Closer to Roanoke, leaders like Wingina of Secretan had already experienced the disruptive influence of the 1585 English military colony, its demands, its violence, its diseases. Relations in 1587 were not starting from zero. They were starting from damaged. It is entirely plausible that, after White sailed away, some neighbouring groups no longer saw the English as useful allies or minor nuisances, but as dangerous liabilities whose presence attracted trouble and distorted older alliances. Under that kind of pressure, conflict could unfold in several ways. One popular image imagines a single overwhelming attack. The palisade stormed, fires lit, everyone killed in a night of sudden violence. But when we look closely at what White reported in 1590, the settlement did not bear the easy marks of a massacre. No burned fort, no obvious signs of struggle, he mentioned. Houses taken down, not scorched. Tools gone, not left to rust where they fell. Could those traces have vanished under 3 years of storms and overgrowth? Possibly. Wood rots, sand shifts. But the absence of clear destruction is one of the reasons many historians hesitate to anchor everything to a single, climactic battle. A slower, more complicated pattern fits the clues as well. Imagine tensions mounting over months, perhaps a hunting ground dispute, perhaps accusations over a theft or a broken promise, perhaps an illness blamed on foreign presence. Relations that began wary but workable could sour bit by bit. In that atmosphere, some colonists might leave earlier than others. A few families persuaded or forced to move under the protection of a different chief further inland. A few killed in ambush or retaliation along the way. Newcomers being redistributed as dependents, labourers, or hostages within existing native political systems. Violence does not always erase people in a single event. Sometimes it fragments them, scattering survivors through other communities where their Englishness is gradually thinned by time and necessity. If groups were taken in this way, through conflict and subsequent absorption, the outward result could strangely resemble the Croatoan scenario. English individuals living within native towns, married into local families, their traces muted in the written record. The difference lies in tone rather than in outcome. One begins as refuge, the other as coercion. From conflict you can follow the river channels north and west, toward another long-standing idea, that some colonists left not just for Croatoan, but for the mainland interior, maybe all the way toward the Chesapeake. The original plan for Raleigh's colony had not centred on Roanoke as an endpoint. Earlier voyages had scouted the Chesapeake Bay region and described it in glowing terms: deeper water, safer harbours, more promising farmland. A place, they thought, for a real city, not a precarious beachhead. White himself, before everything began to unravel, had been instructed to settle up into the country toward that better bay. In that light, Roanoke looks less like the dream and more like a compromise, a temporary foothold accepted because storms, timing and conflict made the preferred site hard to reach. If the colony on Roanoke realized no help was coming soon, reviving that original plan would make sense. Move inland, away from the exposed sandbars and the Spanish cruising lanes. Seek a river mouth or sheltered inlet flowing toward the Chesapeake. Try to reach the kind of country Raleigh's earlier scouts had praised, where permanent fields and a defensible town might be carved out. That kind of migration would not be simple. You don't march 100 people through unfamiliar forest without guidance. They would have needed native pilots, canoes, knowledge of portages between waterways. Each stop along the way would involve negotiation or trespass, hospitality or hostility. It is possible to imagine a chain: Roanoke to Croatoan as temporary refuge, Croatoan to mainland villages to more distant chiefdoms, always with an eye, among some of the English at least, toward that half-mythic destination on the Chesapeake they had heard described but never seen. Later English visitors did report hearing of or searching for such a transplanted group. Stories of survivors living upriver, or of a settlement planned for the Roanoke region. None of those threads tighten into a knot of proof, but they sketch a path along which a portion of the colonists could have moved gradually inland, leaving Roanoke and even Croatoan behind. If so, the carved word Croatoan might record only the first step in a longer, more meandering journey, a waypoint, not a final address. Beneath all these movement theories, toward allies, toward rivers, toward imagined safer lands, there is a quieter force pressing on the story. The simple, relentless pressure of disease, famine, and environmental stress. Roanoke and the Barrier Islands are in many ways marginal environments. Sandy soils leach nutrients. Fresh water can be fickle. Storms batter the coast, salting fields and reshaping shorelines overnight. For newcomers who planted European crops on a timetable suited to English seasons, the margin for error was thin. A single failed harvest could grow into a winter of empty barrels. Fish runs are seasonal. Game moves, temporary success, one good year of planting or trading, can hide the underlying fragility for a while, until a dry spell, a late storm, or a shift in local politics strips away those supports. We do not need a single dramatic event to make a colony disappear. Malnutrition weakens immune systems. Weary, underfed people become susceptible to every infection. A respiratory illness, a gastrointestinal disease, something as simple as contaminated wells. These can move slowly through a community, claimed here and there, until numbers dwindle. In that state, groups fracture. The youngest and strongest may leave in search of food or better alliances, splitting off into smaller bands that attach themselves to different native towns. The old and sick may be left behind or cared for until resources run out. To later eyes, looking back through incomplete records, this kind of drawn-out attrition can look like a single vanishing. But on the ground, it would have been experienced as a sequence of hard choices: who leaves, who stays, which neighbour to trust, which direction to gamble on. Alongside these environmental and human pressures, there is one more shadow that often drifts into the Roanoke story: Spain. In the late 16th century, Spanish power in the Americas was very real along the Caribbean and into Florida. Spanish officials watched English attempts at colonization with suspicion and alarm. They knew that a foothold on the North American coast could threaten their treasure fleets and challenge their claims. We have evidence that Spanish intelligence was aware of Raleigh's ventures. They received reports, attempted to locate English bases, and even dispatched expeditions up the Atlantic seaboard to look for and, if possible, destroy them. From this, some have inferred a dark possibility, that a Spanish force, perhaps from Florida or the West Indies, found the Roanoke settlement between 1587 and 1590, attacked it, and either killed or removed its inhabitants as prisoners, wiping the colony out as a geopolitical nuisance. In a world where Spanish raiding and punitive expeditions did occur elsewhere, such an action is not inherently implausible. It fits the logic of imperial rivalry. But when we look for concrete traces of this scenario at Roanoke itself, the ground grows thin. There is no surviving Spanish report boasting of such a victory. No letter home describing the burning of an English outpost on the Carolina banks. No archaeological layer of clearly Spanish weaponry or artifacts firmly tied to the site and period of the disappearance. Silence is not proof of absence. Records can be lost. Raids can go uncelebrated. Yet historians tend to treat the Spanish attack theory with caution, precisely because its evidentiary base is so slender compared to what we know about Spanish activities further south. If the Spanish did strike, their impact would also have to be reconciled with the orderly departure clues. The carved word, the absence of obvious devastation described by White, the impression that buildings were taken down with some care. A panicked evacuation under fire leaves different marks than an intentional relocation. People fleeing an attacking fleet do not usually pause to disassemble houses neatly or to carve messages according to prearranged codes. When you line these theories up beside that one quiet word on the tree, a pattern emerges. Conflict, whether with neighbouring groups or in more speculative form with Spain, tends to imply abruptness, damage, abandoned goods, and perhaps unburied dead. Some small-scale violence and coercion almost certainly touched the colony's story. The world around Roanoke was not peaceful, but total erasure by a single blow sits uncomfortably with the hints of planning and signalling we have. Flight inland toward the Chesapeake or other riverine areas harmonizes better with an orderly departure. It imagines the colonists using what agency they had left, regrouping, choosing a direction that matched their earlier instructions and hopes, leaving markers behind for a rescue they still half believed would come. Disease, famine, and environmental stress thread through all scenarios as the steady undertow. Even a move to Croatoan, even a migration upriver would have taken place under their weight. They do not contradict the carved word, they help explain why moving on became necessary at all. In the end, none of these theories, conflict, flight inland, epidemic decay, Spanish intervention, stands alone like a single clean answer. They overlap and intertwine. You can imagine a colony weakened by crop failures and illness, pressured by shifting relations with native neighbours, splitting, some toward Croatoan, some further inland. While the threat of European enemies over the horizon added one more layer of anxiety to every decision. The Roanoke mystery persists not because there is no plausible explanation, but because there are several, each tracing a slightly different path through the same sparse set of clues. To follow those paths any further, we have to leave speculation and return to the patient work of evidence, later expeditions, scattered reports, and the careful, quiet labour of archaeologists sifting through sand and midden for any fragment that might still carry a whisper of the colony's fate. The search for Roanoke did not end in 1590, when White turned his ship back toward England, staring at that carved word fading behind him. In some ways, that was when the mystery really began. Back in England, news of the vanished Cittie of Raleigh landed in a world already shifting. The war with Spain, court intrigues, changing priorities, these things dulled the urgency, but they did not erase the question. What happened to them? Raleigh himself, whose name had framed the whole enterprise, still had reasons to care. His patent, his prestige, and his hopes for American wealth all hung on the fate of these colonists. Over the next years we see flickers of attempts, plans for rescue or at least for information. In 1602 he sent Samuel le Mace to the region, officially on a mission of trade and reconnaissance. Unofficially, Raleigh told him to search for the colonists, but the incentives were messy. Mace was allowed to profit from privateering along the way. Time that might have been spent combing the Carolina Sounds could also be spent chasing more immediate prizes on Spanish shipping lanes. By the time Jamestown was founded in 1607, the Roanoke story was already a kind of ghost hanging at the edge of English colonization, close enough to be remembered, distant enough to be neglected when survival demanded attention elsewhere. Yet, the question kept surfacing. Early Jamestown leaders, hearing rumours from native groups, sometimes thought in terms of lost Englishmen further south or west. Captain John Smith recorded reports that a chief named Powhatan had destroyed a settlement of people living in an area called Okanahonan, or Pekarakanik, stories that some later writers tried to link to Roanoke. Others heard of people who spoke from books, or of towns where men dressed in European-style garments. These fragments may be distortions, miscommunications, or memories of other encounters, but they show that English minds remained tuned to the possibility that somewhere, in the tangled hinterlands beyond their own fragile outposts, survivors or their descendants might still exist. None of these threads, though, was pulled tight. No confirmed rescue, no diary of a returned colonist, just rumours flickering on the periphery of more immediate struggles, hunger, diplomacy, war. Over time, the practical search slowly faded, and Roanoke shifted categories, from a current problem to a historical curiosity, from an unfinished mission to an unfinished story. The land itself was changing too. Barrier islands like Roanoke and Hatteras are not fixed, stone-solid pieces of earth. They are restless, low, and mutable, made of sand that water and wind can rearrange with surprising speed. Channels open and close, inlets migrate, storms slice away at shorelines, pile dunes over old ground, and push islands landward grain by grain. What was upland forest in the 16th century can be marsh or open water now. What was shoreline can end up buried under meters of later sand. That matters for archaeology. Finding traces of a small, short-lived settlement on a piece of coast that has been eroding, flooding, and reshaping for centuries is like trying to read a message written on a fogged window after someone has wiped it clean over and over again. Even the exact location of White's city has to be inferred from maps, descriptions, and landscape clues that no longer match the modern coastline perfectly. Some parts of the original site may already lie offshore, eaten by the Atlantic. Others may be buried under later dune fields or altered by 18th and 19th century activity. Despite these obstacles, archaeologists have tried. On Roanoke Island, excavations have uncovered post holes, pits, ceramics, and metal artifacts that align with late 16th century English presence, traces of the 1585 military colony, and perhaps overlapping with the 1587 group. On Hatteras Island, traditionally associated with Croatoan, digs have found European objects mixed into native contexts. Copper ornaments reworked from European metal, parts of gun hardware, glass beads. Some of these finds appear to date close to the Roanoke period, suggesting contact and exchange. But this coast saw multiple waves of European ships over the decades, Spanish, English, later traders and fishermen, so any given artifact must be placed carefully in time. A single buckle or fragment of pottery cannot by itself declare, "This belonged to one of the lost colonists." Inland, at places like the so-called Citex near the Chowan River, archaeologists have uncovered clusters of English-made objects at native settlements that were occupied around the Wright era. A silver seal matrix, fragments of early English ceramics, items that might have arrived through trade, might have moved as heirlooms, or might have been carried by displaced colonists. Each discovery is tantalizing, but none is definitive. There is no skeleton with a clearly European isotopic signature securely dated to the immediate years after 1587. No carefully inscribed notes sealed in a bottle beneath a hearthstone, just scattered objects whose paths from hand to hand are no longer fully traceable. The geography conspires with a fragmentary record to keep the story just out of reach. Eroding coasts remove layers, shifting sands bury others, later settlements disturb earlier ones. Time edits the archive. In that edited space, imagination steps in. By the 19th and 20th centuries, Roanoke had become more than a puzzle for scholars. It had turned into a symbol. Novelists, playwrights, and local historians began to fill the gaps with narrative. Some cast the colonists as tragic martyrs, noble English souls swallowed by wilderness and treachery. Others romanticized the Croatoan connection, weaving tales of fair-haired children in native villages, living proof of a blended fate. Still others leaned into the eeriness of the carved word, treating it almost like an incantation, a haunting refrain. The real Roanoke, muddy, mosquito-ridden, politically entangled, blurred into a more abstract idea, the edge of the known world where familiar rules fail and certainty dissolves. For an expanding English and later American nation, this story could be read in several ways. As a cautionary tale about overreach and poor planning, as a foundation myth of perseverance, Jamestown and later colonies succeeding where Roanoke vanished, the line between failure and eventual empire drawn along that sandy shore, as a quiet reminder that even powerful empires can misplace people and never fully account for them. Over time, the word Croatoan itself took on a life beyond its historical roots. It appears in poems, horror stories, even modern television, often stripped of its original context as the name of a real island and a real indigenous community. It becomes instead a shorthand for disappearance, for the uncanny moment when a human presence is replaced by a single, unexplained trace. This is how myths form, not from lies alone, but from partial records and human longing layered together. We have White's drawings and maps. We have his brief descriptions of what he saw and what he hoped. We have Spanish intelligence reports glimpsing English movements through a hostile lens. We have native oral traditions, altered and reinterpreted across generations. We have the physical landscape, reshaped yet still whispering through artifacts and stratified soil. Around these fragments, centuries of storytellers have built frameworks that match their own fears and desires. In some eras, people emphasized the savagery of the unknown, imagining the colonists overwhelmed by hostile nature or hostile neighbors. In others, they leaned into the possibility of cooperation and blending, seeing Roanoke as an early experiment in cultural fusion rather than a simple failure. Today, the mystery persists in part because it speaks to something deep in us. We live in a world laced with surveillance, records, and data, where disappearance on that scale feels almost impossible. Roanoke reminds us that there was a time, not so long ago in the span of human history, when 100 people could step over the horizon and simply never come back into view. That distance between then and now makes the story feel dreamlike. A community appears in the document, speaks for a few pages, and then the ink runs out. The last word we see is Croatoan, carved in rough capitals, and then the text tears away. Standing at the end of that torn page, it is tempting to choose a single answer. To say with certainty, they went to Croatoan and lived there. Or, they marched inland and faded into later conflicts. Or, they died by hunger and disease, their bones scattered and lost to the sea. But the evidence does not quite let us seal the book so neatly. Instead, it offers overlapping probabilities. A partial move to Croatoan, some families or individuals making their way upriver, a long, uneven struggle with illness, scarcity, and shifting politics, a coastline slowly erasing the footprints they left behind. Somewhere in that braid of possibilities lies the truth of what happened to the men, women, and children of Roanoke. We may never untangle it fully. The sea has claimed too much. The archives have thinned. The living memories have passed into story. Yet the search itself, the archaeology, the careful rereading of old maps, the listening to oral traditions with new respect, keeps the colony from vanishing entirely. Each artifact washed from a bank, each shard of pottery lifted from a trench, is a reminder that they were not ghosts. They were people, as real as we are, who made choices under pressure and left traces that time has tried, but not quite managed to erase. So the mystery continues to haunt us, not as a blank void, but as a quiet room filled with half-heard voices. If you listen closely, you can almost hear them. Splashing oars, the creak of a palisade gate, the scratch of a knife carving letters into living wood, a word on a tree, a vanished town, and a coastline that still holds its secret just beyond the reach of certainty. In the end, when we strip away the later legends and the louder, more dramatic theories, we are left with something quieter and, in a way, more human. A vulnerable settlement on an unstable coast. A small group of families caught between an ocean they could not easily recross and an interior world they did not fully understand. Neighbouring native communities who were not faceless others, but people with their own politics, their own fears, and their own opportunities in the shifting balance of power. Within that web, the most plausible paths seem less like grand disappearances and more like a series of difficult practical decisions. Some colonists may have gone to Croatoan, Hatteras Island, seeking food, shelter, and the protection of an allied community. The carved word could be exactly what it appears to be, a message, an arrow pointing toward that planned destination. Others may have drifted inland, following rivers, latching onto new alliances, or being pulled into conflicts that had nothing to do with their original dream of an English city. Over years, and then decades, their Englishness would have thinned, dissolved into new languages, new names, new loyalties. Hunger, disease, storms, and violence would have claimed some along the way. Not all at once in a single dramatic event, but slowly, in the ordinary grinding way that frontiers wear people down. In that sense, the lost colony may not have vanished in a moment at all. It may have faded, absorbed into native societies, scattered along rivers and sounds, sifted into the soil of a changing coast, until what remained for later generations was not a town to be found, but a trace to be felt. And that brings us back to the word, Croatoan. One proper noun carved with care, surviving when an entire community did not. A place name, a hint of intention, a fragment of a conversation that continued out of sight. History often comes to us like this, not as a complete story with a clean ending, but as a handful of surviving details and the feelings they leave behind. A cartographer's uneven coastline, a few broken potsherds in shifting sand, a rumour about fair-haired children in a distant village, a single word on a tree holding more silence than sound. We live surrounded by records now, photos, messages, location data. But even so, most of our lives will someday be reduced to fragments too. A name in a register, a house deed, a line in someone else's memory. Roanoke reminds us that between those fragments and the full reality of a life, there is always a gap. And that gap is where curiosity, humility, and imagination meet. If you've stayed awake this long, and if you haven't, that's perfectly fine. Thank you for wandering through this mystery with me. If you'd like to help more sleepy history stories find their way to more people, you can gently tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe. If you feel like sharing, I'd love to know, what time is it right now, and where in the world are you listening from? And if this kind of deep, quiet dive into the past appeals to you, you might enjoy the book about prehistoric secrets I mentioned earlier. A slower, longer journey into the very old puzzles that shaped our species. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com. For now, though, we leave the Carolina coast to its tides and storms. The colonists' voices have faded, the palisades are gone, the paths are overgrown. But the carved word remains in our minds, a soft echo that has carried across more than 4 centuries. Croatoan, a place, a clue, a reminder that even when the people are gone, a single mark can keep their story open, inviting us to listen a little longer and then, finally, to rest.